and pagers off at this time. The ringers to your cell phones and pagers, please. Thank you. We now continue our journey in search of personal freedoms. Today's topic, women's rights and the 19th Amendment. Would you please welcome to the stage Susan B. Anthony.
Good morning. I am here to speak to you today, for I fear you have forgotten. What is has not always been so. You may believe that all the privileges, the freedom, and the enjoyment of women always were theirs. And I ask you, do you not know that every single inch of ground that woman stands upon today was gained by a little handful of women from the past? Why do young people know nothing of the past? They believe they sprung up like somebody's gourd, that nothing was done before they came. But I tell you, never forget the spirit of those who came before. Never forget the freedom won, the injustice expunged. Many of you know me, but there are those who don't. My name is Susan Brownell Anthony, and I was born in the year 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts. When I was born, Abraham Lincoln was 11, Ralph Waldo Emerson 17, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton 4. But more importantly for you to know is that when I was born, women's place was in the home. She could no more own property than she could hope to find respectable employment. Women could not even have custody of their very own children. They had no voice in the legal courts and no right to their wages incurred by their labor. I was blessed to have been born into a family of Quakers, a home where women were seen as the equal to their male counterparts. From a very early age, I had all the freedom I could want. My father bequeathed upon me the desire for independence, for an education, and he urged me to follow my instincts on the path to social justice. As a teenager, I, like many girls my age, was oft accompanied to the dance hall. It was there that I witnessed in horror the irresponsible and foolish activities of men who had been drinking alcohol. I soon became aware of the abuse this form of arsenic had on women and children. 1 in every 17 American men was an alcoholic, and 1 in every 5 Americans suffered at their hands. Whether it be public drunkenness in an unregulated society, or the physical and mental abuse experienced in the home, women and children suffered greatly. At my father's cotton mill, I heard women tell stories of husbands beating wives so that they might use their wages to buy more liquor. I worked for a time side by side members of the temperance movement until my authority and my status was questioned because I was a woman. At a temperance convention, I, with others, drafted a resolution. My name appeared on that draft. A man stood and asked that my name be stricken based on my sex. At another temperance convention, I stood to speak on behalf of the Daughters of the Temperance, and I was asked to be seated, for women had been invited to listen, not to speak. I went home to my dear old Quaker father, and I told him that I resolved that for the best of my life, I would spend my time working for the causes of women. I fell to my knees, sobbing, placed my head in his lap. And he said to me gently, "If thee must, Susan, thee must." So began my long road for women's rights. As a young woman, I was overjoyed to receive a position with the New York State school system. But my excitement was early squelched when I realized that my wage was 1/5 that of the male teachers. It was that protest against such inequity, coupled with my frequent visits to the homes of the Negroes, that lay the basis for my dismissal. Yes, my family was very involved in the anti-slavery movement. From the time I was young, we held meetings in our home every Sunday. We were pleasured to listen to the words of great men, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison. I spent years arranging speeches, handing pamphlets and leaflets to the public, hanging posters. So vivid are my memories of the harassment for my views. So clear in my mind the vision of my pictorial image being dragged through the streets. I did go on to teach one other time following such dismissal, for I held a headmistress position at the Canajoharie Academy in Rochester, New York. My professional reputation was quite good, but there I voiced my views. I believe in co-education. I believe that all the facilities of the mind are shared equally, male or female. Both men and women eat, they sleep, they hate, they love, and they desire alike. It would not injure them to share chalk at a blackboard in a classroom. Again, my voice was heard, but not heeded. For of more interest to my peers was my marital status. My having not married caused quite a stir. At every occasion, every interview, I was asked why I did not marry. And I suppose I did not find man necessary to my happiness. I had never found a man whom I loved enough to live with my entire life. Nor did any man find me one he would want to live with his entire life. When I was young, women who had views were condemned to a single estate. Men did not want to marry women with views. I knew this, and I suffered the consequences. But in that time, if a woman married poor, she became a housekeeper and a drudge. If she married wealth, she became a parlor pet and a doll. I hate to think that had I married, I would have spent my entire life as a pet or a drudge. Instead, I felt I should work to amend state law that prohibited the custody of woman's child to her, rather than marrying, having a half a dozen children that were not legally mine. I believed that one day that old idea, the idea that man was created for himself and woman for him, that man was the oak and woman the vine, man the great conservator of wisdom, and woman of love. I believe that that old idea would one day be reverently set aside along with old, exploited philosophies of the ignorant past. But I knew that if woman wanted independence, to stand and fall by her own strength and wisdom, that she must have a voice, a legal voice. For men who passed laws on behalf of women could just as easily take them away without her consent. Suffrage. Women's right to vote. They called it women's rights, but what we fought for was that woman not be wronged. There was much done before my involvement in women's suffrage. When I was busy with the temperance movement, in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention was held, the first public forum in the world discussing women's rights. Those present included the great Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, my younger sister Mary, and my parents. They were of the first to sign the Declaration of Women's Rights. I met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851. 31 years old I was. We started a relationship, a friendship that would last for all our lives. From two different worlds we came, she from wealth and comfort, and I from humble beginnings. She married with children, 7 of them she would have, and I single but married to a cause. She was swift with a pen, and I was driven, and she being oft signed to the home to care for her young, I traveled for years, sharing our collective message. During the Civil War, we set aside suffrage so that we might fight for the Negro. And then in 1868, we created the National Woman Suffrage Association, championing women's rights, equal pay for equal work, custody, and labor privileges. We created The Revolution, a newspaper owned, edited, and written by women. We did much. In 1872, I decided to challenge the constitutionality of the ban on women's right to vote. With some intimidation, I registered in a barbershop. And on November 5th, 1872, I did something I had never done before. I stepped into a booth and cast a ballot for U.S. Grant and the Republican Party. I voted. But shortly after voting, I received a visit from a U.S. Deputy Marshal who read me a warrant and placed me under arrest. My bail was set at $500, and I refused to pay it. My bail was then raised to $1,000, and again I refused to pay. But my lawyer, against my wishes, paid my bail, for he could not see a woman like me in jail. But what he did is eliminated my chance to take my cause to the Supreme Court. Instead, I was scheduled for trial in the local court. Trial was set for the following June. I had months to speak to the public of my case. And speak I did. Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you having been indicted for the alleged crime of voting in the last presidential election without having the right to vote. It shall be my work today to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights, guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution. The preamble to the federal Constitution says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." It was we, the people, not we, the white male citizen, nor yet we, the male citizen, but we, the whole people, who formed this union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to half of our souls, but to all, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of the enjoyments of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the only means of securing them, provided this democratic, Republican government, the ballot. To them, this government has no just powers from the consent of the governed. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, an oligarchy of sex, the most hateful aristocracy ever established on the face of the globe, an oligarchy of wealth where the rich govern the poor, an oligarchy of learning where the educated govern the ignorant, an oligarchy of race where the Saxon governed the African, and this oligarchy of sex, which makes fathers and brothers, husbands and sons, the oligarchies, the oligarchs, over the mother, the daughter, the wife, and the sister, which ordains all men sovereigns, therefore all women subjects, carries dissension, discord, and rebellion into every home in the nation. And if you detect anger in my voice, you're correct. Where was I? Yes, my trial. Well, my trial was a debacle. I was informed that as a woman, I could not testify on my behalf. For because I was a woman, I was incompetent. Judge Ward Hunt had made his decision well before my court session. He ordered the jury to find me guilty without deliberation. And then he made perhaps the gravest error of his judicial career, for he asked me if I had anything to say. Yes, I do, Your Honor. I have many things to say. I spoke for 20 minutes. He interrupting me twice or thrice, and then he found me out of order and fined me $100, a fine I have yet to pay. I spent 30 years after that traveling and speaking from one coast to another on behalf of women's suffrage. And in 1900, I suffered a stroke, which is perhaps why I keep spilling my water. I reflected over my life during my recovery, and I realized that much had been accomplished. When I started on my path of social justice, there were 22 states in the Union. In 1900, there were 45. All of which had passed some form of law for married women's rights. Co-education was a reality. In 1900, 36,000 women enrolled in state universities and private colleges. Women could be found in the workplace in both technical and professional jobs. And the Negro had been emancipated, and male Negroes could vote. This is what made me realize my work was not done. For in 1900, only 4 states in the Union allowed women to vote: Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and you should know this, Idaho. So on the road I again went, speaking for women. My last speaking engagement was in 1906. Baltimore. It was to an audience much like this: students, scholars, and reformers. It is a magnificent sight before me, yet I have looked on so many such audiences, all testifying to the righteousness, the justice, and the worthiness of the cause of women's suffrage. And though I have been striving for over 60 years for that little bit of justice, I fear I might die without obtaining it. I have known all the great reformers, the progressive women, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Gremke sisters, Lucy Stone, a great galaxy of women. When we started down this road, we were but a handful. But I look out over this audience and I see an army. Somehow I know that with such great women consecrating our lives, failure is impossible. Good day.
Many of you are unaware of the fact that I was a professor at Princeton, where I was warmly received by the student body, and frankly, I enjoyed my life. The life of a professor is unique, to be sure. I studied further. I received a PhD from Johns Hopkins in history and politics. I ultimately became president of Princeton University. And there, because of my interest in politics and my desire to make change in this country, and this country sorely needed change, I ran for and was elected to be the governor of the state of New Jersey. And in fact, I thought that's where I would remain until the election came with Mr. William Howard Taft, Mr. Theodore Roosevelt, and that socialist Eugene Debs. I campaigned, and the Republicans split the vote on their side, and Debs took some votes from me. But I was ultimately elected as President of these United States. In that regard, I sought to make some changes, and I did. I had some success, though those of you who review what I have done may find fault with some of what I did. You must think of it in terms of the times. They were different times. They are not as you view them today. For example, I was very proud of the fact that I instituted presidential reforms that kept Negroes segregated in our federal government. It was my personal goal to make sure that they did not share bathrooms with us or work in the same workplace. And I was indeed forceful in that regard. Times have changed today, but that was the fact then, and you must appreciate it for what it was. There were several amendments to our great Constitution in which I was personally responsible. For example, the 16th Amendment, graduated income tax. That is part of my doing, and the reason it became important is there were people in this country, in the nature of Mr. Rockefeller, for example, who had power that was just unbridled, and there were people in this country, such as your good selves, who needed some relief, some help from their government. And how were we to do that except by a graduated income tax, which, as you know from Civil War times, was found to be unconstitutional. So we amended the Constitution. Ergo, it is constitutional. And we are certainly happy about it today, are we not? There was the 17th Amendment. I know most of you here know what the 17th Amendment is, of course. The direct election of senators. Prior to that time, senators were not elected by the direct vote in each state. That has changed, and perhaps one day that arcane electoral college may also go the way of all flesh. But that is not the case. And then there was the 17th Amendment. Not of great concern, perhaps, to some, as was the 18th, which is prohibition. And our Speaker, Ms. Anthony, who I did not know in my lifetime, in not any real personal sense, she was very much against alcohol, as was I. And that was, in my opinion, at least during my lifetime, the most important amendment to yet come before our government and our states. It is true that after I died, that changed. But it was important to take alcohol out of the mainstream of America, and hence that amendment. And then, of course, the one for which Miss Anthony never lived to see, the 19th Amendment. That is suffrage for women. Now, I will be candid with you. I did not agree with suffrage for women. In point of fact, when they started to campaign by chaining themselves to the gates of the White House, by picketing in front of the White House, at first I thought they were humorous, and I would tip my hat to them and say, "Good morning, ladies." And then I realized that, in fact, they were not ladies at all. They were only women. They were discourteous, they were aggressive, they were rude. And I was not going to have that during my administration. And I informed the police, and they obeyed appropriately. And they were arrested and jailed. And I will admit to you candidly that they were not well treated in jail. And that was by design. We were just not going to have these kind of women doing that kind of stuff and embarrassing our government. If they wanted a campaign, let them go somewhere else, to the few states where they could vote. But they were not going to do it on my front lawn, our front lawn. You know, I was a pacifist. That's the way they viewed me. I really didn't see it that way. I knew that going to war was a mistake, and the fact that the Germans were making the Europeans suffer was simply not of concern for us on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And I made it clear that I was going to make it my life's work to keep us out of that European conflict. And I tried my level best. But the Germans torpedoed our boats, and you remember the loss of the Lusitania. That was not a happy event. Hundreds of Americans went down. The fact that we may have been shipping munitions on the Lusitania didn't really matter. We were legally neutral, and we were going to remain that way, and it was my job to keep us out of the war. And in fact, I did. We did not enter during my first administration. And when I campaigned on my second administration, I made it clear that I kept us out of the war. And I did a good job of it. But there were evil people afoot. You all remember the Zimmerman telegram? That's where the German ambassador to Mexico, Mr. Zimmerman, that evil fellow, told the Mexican government that if they cooperated and that if they joined the war against the United States, that upon completion of that conflict, when Germany won, 4 southern states would be delivered to Mexico: Texas, Arizona, New Mexico among them. That, with the reinstitution of unrestricted submarine warfare, caused my feelings to change. And though it was a loathsome act, we had recognized that it might come about, and we built up our army in this country, which was not much. It did not really exist. It was not a modern army. But we ultimately entered that war. And I did so with the knowledge that I would be capable of brokering a peace. And my slogan was, peace without victory. It was not important for some side to have won or another side to have lost, but rather it was important that the conflict ended, the killing ended. And I participated at the Treaty of Versailles. I went personally. I gave my all and negotiated what I thought was the finest piece of international political negotiation ever to occur. And they were embodied in my 14 points. You all remember them well. And the 14th created a League of Nations, a group of all the countries of the world, the great and the small, where issues could be debated and argued so that the war to end all wars would in fact end all wars. And I believe that with all my heart and all my soul. And I came home from Europe, and I campaigned. And I went to almost every state in this union, asserting that we must join the League of Nations. My advisors went and lobbied the Senate. And but for Henry Cabot Lodge, sometimes I think his middle name was Henry the Cad Lodge, he caused the Senate vote to fail, and we did not enter the League of Nations, much to my regret. I never got over that failure. I'll digress briefly because of Miss Anthony's presence today and talk about a change in my perspective. I told you that I was against women's suffrage, and it was a righteous thing that I did. But one of her students, her successor in office, Carrie Chapman Catt, came to me, and we visited, and we talked. And because I listened carefully, I understood the complaints that she had and how women's rights had been denied. And during the end of my first administration, I went before the Congress of the United States. And I told them plainly that my opinion had matured and that theirs should too. And I presented legislation to give suffrage to women. It failed. It was in my next administration, knowing that times had changed, that I had to somehow reorganize my philosophy and become more progressive. And what I did was, I made it clear that I would formally campaign for the 19th Amendment. And I think that that was one of the key features that permitted me to be reelected. And then, during my administration, the 19th Amendment occurred. I know you remember how we went around this country in the legislatures of the states looking for that magic 36, because we needed at least 36 states in their legislatures to ratify and affirm the amendment to make it a lawful amendment. And I remember well, as Tennessee, the 36th state, was about to vote. And the election was just that close. And it could have well been lost. But one legislator received a note from his mother reminding him of who she was. And he changed his vote. And the magic 36 was reached. And so the 19th Amendment came into existence. You didn't live to see it, but it happened. And retrospectively, I was wrong on some of the issues. But that is the maturation process that presidents go through. So I thank you for your efforts, madam. Some of the things that I did that I thought was progressive, some of you may disagree with them. There were certainly people that disagreed with them then. Federal Reserve. We needed to somehow control the economics of this country. I created Federal Reserve. Created a tariff act to control the flow of products from outside the country where labor was cheap. We could control some of that. Clayton Antitrust Act. There were people in this country who had power, who controlled prices. Mines, oil, power. They needed to be controlled. Trusts had to be addressed, and so we did. The seamen that worked on our ships, American flag ships, were slaves. They were indentured servants. We passed the Seamen's Act to give them fair labor conditions. The Farm Loan Act. Our farmers were starving. For the first time, the United States of America was willing to loan money to farmers to improve their farms. Child labor. Children working 7 days a week, 12-hour days. It was not only unseemly, it was unjust. We passed the Child Labor Act. And what we did was prevent the sale in interstate commerce of products made with child labor. It isn't always easy to control what the states do. We use the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution to effect that control. We created what you know to be the Workers' Compensation Acts under federal law to give some protection to the working people in this country. There are some things of which I am proud. I thought it was a wonderful thing for me to ask that great statesman, that biblical scholar, William Jennings Bryan, to be our Secretary of State. Regrettably, he was a force that could not be held in check. And during my second administration, he and I came to a parting of the ways, and I was pleased to see him go. My dear friend Louis Brandeis, the Boston lawyer, he was a Jew, you know. I was somewhat ashamed of myself for not bringing him into my cabinet in the first instance, but the pressures were such that I could not do it. But what I did do during my second administration is make him the first Jewish justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America, and a fine justice he was. I was proud to have known him. When I came back from Europe at the end of the Second War, I knew how important the League of Nations was, and I shared with you how I campaigned. That did me in. You see, the public did not know that as a young man I was dyslexic. They didn't even know the word. But I couldn't read, yet I became a college professor. But I kept secret not only that fact, but that I had had several strokes during my life. And my body was weakened. And after I campaigned unsuccessfully for the League of Nations to be part of our accepted governmental policy, I stroked badly. And during the last year of my administration, my vice president tried to take over because he thought that I was impaired. Well, my body was impaired. I could not move my left side at all. But my mind worked. And I could not speak well, but my dear wife kept those people away. And for a year, few, if any, knew how disabled I physically was. And I finished my administration through the efforts of my wife. Could not have happened without her help. I left office in 1921. I did the best I could. I do not know how history will receive me, but I tell you this, I did what was right for the people of this country as I saw it. I left a legacy of amendments to the Constitution that made this country a better place. And I died, regretting my greatest failure, that we did not enter the League of Nations. I never got over that fact. I very much appreciate that you have come here today to allow me to review some of the history of my life. Being President of the United States is an awesome burden. I hope I did it well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Ms. Anthony. We'll have a little time for questions, and I'll come around with the mic. Who would like to ask the first question? Mr. Flint.
Thank you. I would wonder if both of you would comment briefly on why in your times women were thought to be incompetent. What was the rationale for that point of view?
That's easy. They were. You have to understand that there were many people who viewed women as chattels historically. There was a need for women to stay home and have children, to care for the hearth and home. And that was a philosophy that was really respected by most American men. Remember, it was men, M-E-N, that served on juries. The Constitution spoke of men. Women were not men. It took a major change in thinking to change the words of the Constitution into the meaning of the Constitution.
Ms. Anthony.
And it was men who went to war. Women, historically, have never had their rights. Religions oft place women below men. And that is not how it should be, but that is how it has been.
You know, we learn what we learn at our parents' knee. That is the way I was taught. And when I went to church and listened to my minister, he spoke the same way. He used biblical verse to support it. He used the Constitution to support it. As a twig is bent, so grows the tree. So that's the way we were.
Men misunderstand women because they do not understand the physiology and the biology. Women are different. We do things that men do not do, and we do them oft when men do not want us to do them. Physically, our differences scare men.
Well, they never actually scared me.
Told you it would be a debate. Next question, please. Who wishes to ask the next question?
Susan, if you were born in a different period of time, do you think you could be the first woman president? And President Wilson, do you, what is your opinion of a woman president?
Well, giving women the vote is one thing.
Miss Anthony was asked first, sir.
Excuse me.
The president doesn't always get to go first. Miss Anthony.
If I were born in a different time, no, I don't believe I would be a president, for I have always had too many enemies. But I do believe that one day there will be a female president. and that much will be accomplished by a female in the office of the presidency.
You know, the differences that Ms. Anthony spoke about between men and women, they're real. We cannot hide from them. They're biologically true. I must tell you from my perspective, there will never be a woman president, nor will there be a woman in the cabinet. Perhaps there will be a woman lawyer one day. That may happen, but no.
Oh, that's
no, I don't
hubbub.
think so.
Next question.
President Wilson, did you ever learn to read, and how did you, I know your wife helped you a lot by keeping this away from a lot of people, but how did you hide the fact that you couldn't read?
Well, you must understand that you here have available to you television, radio. We did not have the kind of intrusion into the presidential privacy that you see today. You were told what you needed to know. The press, now we didn't manage the press, but the press was much more respectful than they have been of some of my later presidents, of our later presidents. If you didn't see me, you wouldn't know. It just never got out. I didn't go out, and I didn't tell you, and I kept it secret.
Next question. We have a quiet audience today. You have a great audience. Great group. Good.
Miss Anthony, you mentioned that people questioned you why you didn't get married. Did anyone ever question your sexuality?
Not to me, but they may have. I didn't care what they thought.
Other questions? Mr. Mand.
Mr. President, looking back on the 18th Amendment and Prohibition, do you think it was a good idea? Looking back, was it a good idea? Prohibition, and what would be your feelings today on legalizing drugs?
Well, obviously we were right then. Prohibiting the use of alcohol was the correct thing to do. It worked well. Crime was down. No one made a profit from it. And in the years to come, they will do the same thing with drugs. They will make that illegal. They will put people in prison for doing it, and they will completely remove drugs from our society. There isn't a question in my mind that it was successful then, as the war on drugs will be successful in the years to come. Now, if you believe that.
Miss Anthony, I'd like you to comment on the movement to secure women's rights with William Lloyd Garrison. That movement was being led by Mr. Garrison was fairly strong, and then it seemed to lose momentum, and I'd like you to comment on that, whether it was just the issue of slavery or were there some other causes that prevented the women's rights movement from going forward with more strength.
Well, some of the members of these movements had a broad spectrum of ideas. They focused on not just suffrage, but slavery and legal rights with jobs, guardianship. Some were conservatives and some were, they called us radical. I do believe that the dissension in these movements may have been because they lost focus. But I do know that those who fought for slavery achieved their goal. And perhaps it's that we put on hold our suffrage movement so that slavery could be abolished, that we lost steam, as you say.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's always my pleasure to ask our performers to come out of character, and I'm so delighted as I was yesterday to say these are two very good friends of mine. First of all, I would like to ask Susan B. Anthony to please stand and introduce her as Charlotte Chittick, who is a full-time history professor at Idaho College. Let's thank her.
Thank you.
Charlotte. She has performed for us before, and she's incredibly gifted, and she had a wonderful makeup artist today, and I didn't recognize her this morning. She's highly gifted. Charlotte, take just a moment to tell the audience what it means to you to perform this way for them.
Oh, I do. I still have a mic on. Oh, it feels so good to be me again. When you study a character like this, when you go this in depth, they invade your whole life, and you learn sometimes more about them than you really want to know. But studying someone like Susan B. Anthony is inspirational. You know, my focus in my teaching is world history and Native American history, and so this was somewhat of a stretch for me, but yet, you know, women have been the same throughout history. They've been feared and hated and mistreated in some areas. In other areas, they've had power. And you do have these distinguished personalities that pop up periodically for over thousands of years. And Susan B. Anthony is just one of those people that makes such an incredible statement. You really wonder what the world would have been like without her. And so I was very honored to study her. She exhausted me, though.
You did a brilliant job. Thank you. And I'm equally proud to ask President Woodrow Wilson to stand and introduce him as an attorney, Harvey Richmond. Let's thank him also. Let me say about my friend Harvey, he's been so gracious and consented for now 5 years to perform, and he's played all across the board. He played Gandhi, and it was very powerful, and he played a minister, and he's played a president. The other thing I want to say about Harvey, and then he'll also respond like Charlotte did, he is really a great civil rights attorney, and on different occasions when someone needed assistance and support in this community, he was there, and that's one of the great roles of attorneys. He's a great civil rights attorney. Harvey, give us your experience.
Tony, thank you very much, and I do enjoy being here. I graduated college as an invertebrate zoologist. If that means anything, I don't know what I was going to do with it. But Tony has made me into a history major because when I did Mohandas Gandhi, I had to completely revamp my thinking on my perspective in life. And then I was Karl Marx. I don't know how you play one against the other, but that happened. And then I was St. Francis, so blessed and damned, I don't know what I'm going to do next. But it has been a good experience. It is a worthwhile event, and it is always a pleasure to have an audience as warm and as cordial as you were. Thank you.
What I'd like to say to my two friends and all the others that have performed and will be performing, and we've had over 200 people that have performed now in the last 7 years. Your greatest compliment comes from individuals, particularly students, when I see their critiques, and they say this, that I truly felt that I'd gone back in history and actually had the opportunity to talk with that person. What a great compliment. We're grateful to you, and we hope to continue to have such strong programs. Let me invite you back at 1 o'clock today. We have a great actress from Seattle, and she's going to be doing Sojourner Truth. I met with her last night. I did a TV show with her yesterday, and she's incredibly powerful, and you'll really be touched today at 1 o'clock. And then tomorrow we will conclude our great week and how much enjoyment we've had with you. At 11 o'clock we will hear that very famous argument before the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And we have a professor from Gonzaga University and a lawyer from Coeur d'Alene arguing. Thurgood Marshall will be represented from the professor at Gonzaga, and Rich Cook will do John W. Davis. And we found out in this research that there's only 7 copies in this country of the oral argument on that case in 1954. It was there in 53, 54, and 55. And they've been able to acquire a copy from Washington State University. And we will have all 9 members of the court, and Dr. Michael Burke of North Idaho College will play Chief Justice Earl Warren. It'll be a very formal argument before the court, and then the court will give you their decision. At 11 o'clock will be that program. Then at 1 o'clock, we have a wonderful panel over in the Student Union of famous women in history. And then I hope you'll come back tomorrow evening to conclude our week with a great concert with the Coeur d'Alene Symphony concentrating on Beethoven's work. Be with us at 1, and you're a wonderful audience today, and thank you for coming.